our backyards. We have a special interest in making the connection between the people who we grew up around and care about and the people who are, boy, that's alarming. So, and I'm on camera all the time.
Welcome to the future, Gwen. Welcome to the future. Sorry.
No, my point being that you're fortunate to be in the presence of 4 of the journalists who have been around the world. When I begin to tell you a little bit about each of them, you will understand what you're about to learn here. Because they have, each of them, more knowledge in their pinky fingers than most of us have about the world. When I started working at the NewsHour at PBS some years ago, I would say I knew this much about foreign policy coverage, mostly because I was interested in domestic politics and domestic issues, and I didn't really pay that much attention to what was happening, and then I was forced to because that was the kind of news we covered. And I've discovered then and every day since that there's a direct connection between the world that we live in immediately and the world that we live in globally. And we do ourselves a huge disservice when we don't find a way to make those connections and instantly know how to make them. These are the people who have figured out how to do it and have done it so well. I'm going to tell them in order of the way they're sitting. To my far left is Alfonso Van Marsh. He's an international journalist. He's still based in Beirut.
Yes.
Based in Beirut. He's also been based in London. And he's been based in Cairo. He's former CBS and CNN. He wrote the story of Saddam Hussein's capture. You remember that? And he is he knows more than he has said. So we'll get to him. Next to him is Simmons. She's the LA Times global development writer and editor. She's also been based in Russia, Kenya, South Africa, and she's reported from Iraq and has a lovely British accent because she is indeed British. Mississippi? What? How did you? We'll get back to that. Okay. Fine.
Did you
Mark
fact check
Lacey.
these bios?
I know. What is this? Wikipedia fails me again. Mark Lacey is a former colleague of mine. He's at the New York Times. He has just been promoted to national editor. Yay.
Woo! And I hear you're hiring, Mark.
Why do you think they're applauding? Formerly based in
You have a job, and you have a job, and you have a job.
He's formerly based in Nairobi, Mexico City, and Phoenix, if that makes any sense. He's he was deputy foreign editor and assistant managing editor for Weekend News. And to his right is John Yearwood, my Caribbean brother. He's with the Yearwood Media Group. He's don't leave me hanging.
Pay attention. He was basking in the glory. He was basking in the glory.
This is over, okay? Former world editor of the Miami Herald and executive board chairman of the International Press Institute. I'm thrilled to be in all of their presence, and I hope that you are too, because I think we're going to have a good time here, and then there will be food. But I want to start by asking each of you, just to give me a general understanding. There are people at this convention who want to cover weather, who want to cover riots in Ferguson, which is worthy. There are people here who want to cover politics, like me. But you have to make a decision at some point in your career that you want to cover international news. It takes more than a notion to decide that's what you want to do, and to then allow you to do it. So I want to start with you, Alfonso. Why did you decide you wanted to do international news? And tell me about the path that got you into it.
Sure. My path is definitely unusual. For me, it was kind of growing up and seeing. Hello. I'm sorry. I don't see so many wonderful faces. I'm sorry. I haven't seen it in a while. For me, it was kind of growing up watching it and kind of admiring the Dateline NBC, Nightline, 2020 kind of stories, Lair kind of stories, and saying when they did do international news, that was much more interesting to me than going through the traditional path in broadcast and wind up doing, the market, 256 on Lulu's Barbecue Shack just burned down. I'm live. I said, somehow I'm going to avoid that. I do not want to do that. And it's a fine path for other people, but I said, how can I get around this and go directly to international news? It was through just researching what is now on the NABJ global kind of database, different fellowships and internships, and I found one that took young journalists to the Middle East. The idea was to have them work in magazines or television stations when they're younger to understand the context and the issues in the region, so when something huge happened, they had the right background so they can report more accurately. So 4 days after I graduated, I got on a plane Egypt with the idea to stay 3 months, wound up staying 4 years. And during those 4 years, having interned with CNN, every time I covered, a bombing or a terror attack or a hotel opening, I would take a picture of myself on the story, print it out, put it on a piece of cardboard, send it to CNN, and I wrote on the back, "Had you hired me, I'd be doing this for you right now."
So you were throwing shade using the postal service. Dang. That's old school.
After 4 years, they finally hired me full time. And oddly enough, I had come back to CNN DC where I'd interned a long time ago, and they had kept on a bulletin board all of those postcards. And the idea was, this is what shameless ambition looks like, but it was really, if you see this man, call security. He's very, very determined. So that was the start of my career in Egypt, freelanced, and then got hired by CNN and just kept moving along with them. Cairo, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Istanbul, London.
Jay, you have a...
I'm very lucky in the sense to say to the help also, and this is important, of NABJ, who recognized my work before my own colleagues did. That was the big boost that got me to my dream job, and I feel very lucky that I've had my dream job with 2 networks, and I'm really excited for the next path.
That's wonderful. That sounds familiar, the part about the NABJ boost. Ann Simmons, tell us your story.
Selfies of myself. But I actually was born and raised in London, England. So when I got here, I felt very much that I was still of Caribbean descent, I might add. And so when I arrived, I was obviously a foreigner. But I was very strategic. My undergraduate degree is a double honours in Russian and Norwegian, and I actually studied those languages knowing that one day I want to be a foreign correspondent, and specifically for the Russia part of it, because at that time we still had the Cold War, Russia was very closed off, and I knew that I always had this fascination with that particular nation, then the Soviet Union, obviously. So I'll just very briefly say that my first foreign posting was actually to Moscow for Time magazine. And one of the reasons they sent me there was because I spoke the language. And I know we're going to get to, kind of what is essential. Knowing the language definitely helps. It also, because I had lived and studied in Russia before I became a journalist as a student, that was part of my course. So I knew Moscow quite well, and I had a friends there, had a network of friends, so I was able to say, well, you can drop me in immediately, and I would be fine. So that was my first role. I was covering then in a bureau with, 2 correspondents and a bureau chief. The other correspondent actually was Jay Carney, who ended up becoming our promised spokesperson. Wow. And I was there for 3 years covering the former Soviet Union. After that, I actually became a State Department correspondent covering the State Department and foreign policy when Warren Christopher was a Secretary of State, and that was during the first Clinton administration. And that then exposed me to the Middle East. Basically, the main trips there were to the Middle East in much quieter times, so Syria, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel. I was able to kind of get a taste of different journalism, different foreign correspondence, if you wish, because it's not like doing field reporting. That isn't actually my favorite type of reporting, because I always found that it was more, well, not manufactured, but if the principal sneezed, it was in a press release. It's unlike being out in the field where you're out there talking to regular people on the ground. I always call myself a foot soldier because I don't like to get my hands dirty, but I do like to sleep on clean sheets indeed. And while I was in Washington doing that, I was actually, I covered the intervention of US troops into Bosnia. I was embedded, when we first started embedding journalists, I was embedded with the US Army. And at that time, you actually had to dress as a soldier with a press tag, but you had to wear the flak jacket, the helmet, blah, blah, blah. I can talk a bit more about that later. And I also covered the intervention of US troops into Haiti to restore Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was deposed and living in the United States. Just to quickly wrap up, I was was then hired, while I was still in DC, as the Nairobi bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. At a time when the Los Angeles Times had bureaus all around the world. And we still have some bureaus, but obviously not as many. And in Nairobi, I was covering East Central and West Africa. Probably about 30 countries. So always on the road, a lot going on. To be honest, unfortunately, a lot of conflicts at that time, but my aim was to make sure that, you know that Africa is not just about conflicts, famine, and corruption. There are other stories as well. And then I was based in Johannesburg, covering Southern Africa. To wrap up, when I got back to LA, I did rotations in Iraq, temporary rotations in Iraq. I think we may have overlapped on one of those. And that's about it.
That's a lot. Mark Lacey.
I'm sure Anne could continue on. First, my ties to the Caribbean. I lived 5 years in Jamaica as a kid. Thank you. So it was always my dream to be a foreign correspondent, and I worked at the LA Times, and I did all the sort of jobs of City Hall and general assignment, and then I moved to Washington. And I think how I became a foreign correspondent, they were looking for someone temporarily to go to northern Albania during the Kosovo War, and I spent 6 weeks in this little town interviewing refugees as they crossed over, and it was really rugged conditions, and we were packed in this house of a lot of journalists, and I just loved it. It was an amazing time. So it was 6 weeks, and then I said I have to do this, permanently, and I moved over to the New York Times, and my first job was covering the White House during the Clinton administration, the tail end of the Clinton administration, and so the White House correspondent goes on all of the the overseas trips, and the custom is that the White House correspondent covers the story, even though the foreign correspondent who really knows the story overseas, they've lived the story. The White House correspondent swoops in for a matter of hours and has to write about Northern Ireland or Nigeria or wherever. And so it's sort of a crash course in Clinton was traveling like mad, and so you had to study up on the world very quickly. And then I spent 5 years in Nairobi and then 4 years in Mexico. But learning a language is key. I studied Spanish, and then I spoke French, but it was so abysmal that rebel soldiers in Congo would diffuse the situations. They would laugh at my and so, but basically, foreign correspondents.
It's up to you. You can keep doing it.
And for newspapers, need to be able to write every possible kind of story, and so it's really what's the best training? The actual journalism is very similar to what you do in the United States, but it's just being able to do everything, anything, being comfortable in uncomfortable places, dealing with logistics. Sometimes getting to the story is the most important thing, and so you have to just be good at talking your way through difficult situations and finding alternative routes, that sort of thing. So I have just I've had my dream jobs. East Africa for 5 years was a dream job. Mexico was a dream job, and so I'll stop there.
John.
Okay, I guess my journey began, in a room much like this one at an NABJ convention. I would say actually the room was a little bit easier to find. About 30 years ago in Miami, and I was sitting back in the room as one of the sessions NABJ had on being a foreign correspondent, and I was interested in the topic partly because, as Gwen pointed out, I'm from the Caribbean. I grew up in Trinidad, and I had that sense and interest in the world, and as some people may say, a little wanderlust. And so I came in and wanted to know what this was all about, and what what were people doing. And there was a young reporter from a station in Australia who happened to have been on the panel and was talking about what it was like to travel and talk to different people and sort of make a difference. And interestingly, she was talking about Australia. And I left the room saying, yeah, that's for me, that's what I want to do. And then the question is, my God, how do I do it? Because it's one of the hardest jobs to get at any newspaper. At that time, 30 years ago, a lot more newspapers or wire services had foreign correspondents, and I was just leaving the AP at the time. And Nate Polsky, the former foreign editor of the AP, I went to meet with him and said, okay, I'm interested in foreign, what do you do? And he says, well, and I told him actually I was going to London on vacation, and he says, stop into our bureau in London and see what it's like, see if you like it, talk to some people. And I came back from London a little bit disillusioned because it was folks in London doing what I was doing in Oklahoma City, sitting in a room writing, and there wasn't the sense of daring and the sense of excitement and wonder that a foreign correspondent does. He said, well, maybe I'll try a different path to get there. I went to the Dallas Morning News, and that's had some foreign correspondents, but not a lot. But I was also growing interested more so in Africa, and partly because of my buddy Bill Gallo, who everyone needs to know. He's done a lot of work on the continent, has been doing it for a long time. And he's taken many journalists to Africa. One of the things that someone show the folks in your newsroom that what you can do, one of the best things to do is that when you're on vacation, pitch a few stories. And my first big vacation, and some people have talked about Africa, was to East Africa. I went to Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And in fact, it was just after the civil war had ended in Ethiopia, and I made my way into Asmara. But the real story was out of Tanzania. I went to my foreign editor and said, look, I'm going to Tanzania. We don't know very much about the country. What we do know is that there was an economic miracle happening there when you consider that a lot of its neighbors were in total chaos. So when we did, I came back with a good story in Tanzania, and then this guy's nobody what he's doing. And Kevin Merida, whom I just saw downstairs, was eventually became an assistant managing editor at the Dallas Morning News, and he knew of my interest. And at the same time, we were seeing these multi-party democracies appearing throughout Africa. And I went to him and I said, we need to report on that. He says, well, I tell you what, I'll team up with you. I'll go to Washington, and if you travel around Africa, and I was just blown away. That he says, we'll send you around Africa doing stories about party democracy. And one of those trips I happened to, I was in Zaire just as Mobutu Sese Seko, a real old name, was being chased out of office, and I was sort of stuck because a military uprising happened as I arrived. And I was stuck in Zaire for a little over a week because all the borders were closed, and literally I had to be evacuated across the Congo River to get out. But that led to more and more stories, international stories, and eventually I made it to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram as a national, international editor. And my dream job was to become the world editor of the Miami Herald. And the way I got there was at another NABJ convention. I had lunch with the night Ritter at the time, vice president of recruiting, and he asked, what do you want to do with the company next? And I said, well, I'd love to go to Miami at some point should the job ever come up, and I know the guy who has it, and to get him out of it, you'll have to run him over with a truck. But if that should happen, I would love to be considered. And
that mysteriously a truck.
And maybe about a year later, I got a call that, guess what? That job is available if you want to interview for it. It's an opportunity. So interviewed and I got it. And after that, it was off to the races. I've had an amazing 13 years at the Herald as a national, international editor. So.
I still want to know how the keys to the truck ended up in your mailbox.
Over-adult beverages later.
Exactly. That's a deal. You know, we're going to talk a little bit among ourselves up here just about what they're thinking about the things they do and how they got to their dream jobs. And then I want to open it up to you. So I know you have really smart questions, no doubt smarter than I have. And I really want us to have a conversation. But I want to start with you, Alfonso, and I want you all to think about this. Just tell us a story or an episode in your career in which you thought to yourself, great, this is perfect, this is why I got into this. And tell us a story of a moment where you said, what am I doing? How did I end up here? This was a mistake.
This is what I meant for is easy. This is, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you are, it's just telling a great story. And I think an important point that Anne brought up too is the idea of being strategic and creating your own opportunity in your career. And for me, this leads to your question, is I was, again, lucky enough to be sent to Nairobi for maternity cover for a colleague at CNN. And yay, Ted Turner, it was 6 months. It was an amazing long run in Nairobi. And at that time, it was all about the millennium in 1999 into 2000. And everybody and their sister was doing all these great stories. And I said, all right, strategically, how can I get on the map as a still aspiring, not formally a correspondent yet? How can I do something different? And while everybody else was talking about how computers were going to fail and buildings were going to fall in the sky and blah, 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 I said, well, in Nairobi, why don't I pitch a story about the one place where nobody gives a damn about 1999, 2000. So that worked. And so we went by plane for a couple of hours, and I'm talking like 2-seater plane where you can't fall asleep because you hit the equipment and crash and stuff. And then we went by truck, in the back of a truck. We went basically between we went way up north the Kenya border, and we got the truck. Then we went by boat, and there was a boat, and the man and I were crossing this river, and around us, because cattle stealing, for lack of a better term, is a bit of an issue. Different groups will steal cattle from each other. So you have these men with AK-47 rifles over their head, guns over their head, as they cross the river, and you have these absolutely stunning women and their children, with these traditional outfits, also crossing the river. And there's our cameraman and I'm holding the tripod, and my, of course, and he's holding his camera, and there are like literally hundreds of sheep and goats buying and stuff. And I'm just looking across to where our destination was, this really isolated place. I'm seeing these bananas on the coast and these goats going by, and my cameraman's saying, whatever you do, don't drink the water, because those cows and sheep are letting everything out. But my point is, I just stood there, and I looked at him, and I looked and said, this is what I was meant to do, to be able to share incredible stories like this one village where people had never heard of the millennium, in terms of, the world coming to an end, and they certainly did not care. And I just felt so very grateful to be, in this place and to share this kind of story. And I said, that's what I was meant for, so that was easy.
How about what you weren't meant for? I saw you try to skip over
that. Well, but here's the thing too, and for those of you that know me, is I'm always looking on the bright side. Always. Every horrible situation has got an opportunity attached to it. You just have to create it. And in my case, it goes back to the Saddam story. I was at CNN for a while, hadn't been a full-time correspondent, wanted to be a full-time correspondent, had been out and about. And so basically I approached the management and said, look, if I'm not good enough, just tell me, and I'll go somewhere else, you know, whatever, I'll get over it. And I said, but otherwise, you need to make me a full-time correspondent. And they said, okay, Mr. Smarty, you're off to Baghdad. And I was like, what? And this was back at the time where I was doing more of the, you know, multimedia one-man band work, shooting, producing, transmitting my own stuff. Because I learned strategically, the more skills I had, the harder it would be for anybody to deny me the stories I wanted. So I was sent to Baghdad, and then after that, I was sent to what I thought would be replacing producer, correspondent, and security advisor in Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown. But as the armored vehicle dropped me off up there, went to get the team, they were like, okay, enjoy. And I said, enjoy what? They said, you'll be on your own shooting, and you're your own producer, your own editor, your own everything. I said, well, will I get a producer with me? No, you say you can produce. How about security? Oh, but we're going to embed you with the U.S. forces there, so you'll be fine. I was like, oh. So instead of being angry and complaining, I said, you know, how can I make the most of this? And I just really took advantage of the time of being all by myself with U.S. forces, with a satellite phone and internet connection, made me the coolest person on the military base. Because the U.S. service members could send an email to their mom or maybe make a quick phone call, build those relationships while I was there. Long story shorter is because of those relationships, I was able to determine and figure out when those very same service members captured Saddam Hussein. And because I was shooting my own video, they were celebrating. I was right on my own camera. They didn't see it. I said, oh, it's huge. And once I put the pieces of the puzzle together to learn that,
they had the pictures.
They had the pictures. We had the exclusive. And the next day, they made me a full-time correspondent.
Okay, Ann, top that.
For me, it's kind of making a difference. And I think there are so many stories that I've covered where they may not be glamorous, may not be sexy, but they've ended up making a difference. And on those occasions, I felt, this is why I got into this. And I'll give one example. I have so many stories. Working in Sierra Leone following the civil war there, I had gone to an MT camp in Freetown. And this camp was where people, it was, you know, walking in there, I always say this, and I don't say this with, you know, kind of, the only way I can articulate it is that I saw these people coming towards me. Some had no arms, other one leg, you know, nose chopped off, an ear gone, eyebrows taken off, and it was almost like I say, a freak show. And I say that, you know, not trying to offend. People came up to me as they entered, and there was one young man I remember who came up to me and said that, you know, he was an English student and he had an arm missing, and he wanted to be my guide in the camp. And they called me Miss Los Angeles Times. So Miss Los Angeles Times. So I said, fine, you know, definitely, you know, and please be my guide. So he will show me around this camp. And the level of atrocity was just so staggering. I remember thinking, how can I capture this? How can I tell this story so that people really get what's gone on here? And for me, it was when this young man took me to this woman who was sitting there. She was 8 months pregnant, sitting on the ground, and both of her arms had been amputated by rebel soldiers. And she had been impregnated by a rebel soldier. She had been raped. And I stood there thinking, you know, the horror of this, I have to tell this story so that people can know what's going on here. And just to fast forward a bit, those people in that camp were among those who ended up forgiving the rebels when they had the amnesty in Simmons. And she said, I forgive someone when you have gone through that. It was just to give you the context. The rebel soldiers were, maybe it was chopping off the arm, and Jibril, you can actually attest with your
Oh, yeah.
It was kind of young because I think this was the signal for if you were voting for the president, this was his wave. And so many people had their arms chopped off. There was this one young girl, I remember, who I actually led my story with. She was probably something like 8 years old, 7 or 8, and she had had her right hand taken off. And I remember asking her, what would how do you feel, what would you like to do when you grow up? I heard that you were a really smart young lady in school. And she actually told me that she was hoping that one day, first of all, her hand would grow back. And then she could go on to her life. Because she just didn't understand why that this had happened to her. And so for me, telling that story and writing that story, which got on A1 for the LA Times, there was an outpouring of support. How can we help? What can we send? For me, that's what I think. My God, I get emotional because I think this is why I'm there, because I want to tell those stories and I want people to care. So that's just one example. The example for me of not kind of thinking, and I'm like you, I'm an optimist, there's always a silver lining. But I've got to tell, I've been in some scrapes and I've been overseas. In 2003, I was on assignment in Baghdad. And to cut a really long story short, a group of us expatriates, it was New Year's Eve, a group of us expatriates was deciding that we were going to see the New Year in. And at a restaurant, at one of the Christian restaurants that was serving diplomats and journalists. And I remember thinking I didn't want to go because I had learned kind of a couple of days earlier that my best friend in the world, a guy called Edward Ruiz, who was my photographer when I was based in Johannesburg, had drowned on Christmas Eve in a freak accident. And I was actually trying to leave Baghdad to get to his funeral in Cape Town because he was still based in South Africa. And so I was really upset and I thought, I don't want to go to this to celebrate, but I remember thinking a year earlier, it was me, my friend Edward, and a group of us who were partying in Havana. And I remember thinking, he wouldn't want me to be like sitting around moping, let me go out and see the New Year in with all the others. So we went in convoy, and we arrived at this restaurant, and just as we pulled up, and I had my hand on the handle, a bomb went off. A suicide bomber drove his car into the entrance of the restaurant, and the whole thing just went up. I mean, that's all I remember. The next I remember being buried in my car with all this stuff in my mouth was like, I can't breathe, where am I? My God, if this is it for me, please don't let my mother suffer, was what I remember thinking. Then I heard, Sudanese! The Iraqis who were trying to pull me out of this wreck thought I was Sudanese. So I'm like, hey, whatever, just get me out of here. Won't be Sudanese, Because lots of Sudanese workers were working in Iraq at the time. So they pulled me out. I had severe injuries to my face, I've still got glass embedded in my head, and it took like 2-3 years to work with a dermatologist to pick the glass out of my face. And I think now that no one can even tell, thank God, if you saw the pictures back then. And just to end this story, we get thrown on the back of a pickup truck, because I wasn't the worst injured. One of my colleagues in the car in front of me lost his right eye, crisscrossed. I was in the back seat of the car. The one in the front, she had extensive damage to her face and hands. They this for Chris on the back of the pickup. And I was thinking, I can't see the blood. It was just that the debris in my eyes, and so I was saying, oh my God, I see! And he was actually broken short bags up. They couldn't pick up and they couldn't be in the hospital. And I remember they threw me on this slab, and then they tried to start to stitch up my head without anesthesia. I'm thinking, I shouldn't be here. I suppose that's what I thought.
That was a good moment to think that, yes.
So I started flailing around, and they're like, okay, just leave her, because there are all of these other bodies there, who were also being into the night. Several people, of course, died when the suicide bomber, rammed his car into the building. And then how we get out of it, really long story short, one of our staffers, because we were far from the office, commandeered an ambulance, put us expatriates basically in the back, and we could go to the green zone where the US military hospital was based. We get there, we pull up, and we come to towards the green zone. So we hear them screaming, they say, open up the back, what do you have in there, you know? So they open up the back and then they see us all banged up and bloody and say, oh my God, there are Americans in there. Oh, actually, no, I'm British.
Not the time to bring
Not the time. Not the time, man. Not the time.
Let us off, and we were so-called walking wounded, and then the story of me trying to get out of there to get back to is another story. It took forever.
These stories are great. Okay,
Listen, tone it down, guys. You're supposed to be encouraging people to become.
are you part of this panel? I'm confused, Mark.
I'm so emotionally drained, I don't know. So, like, my gosh, and the more positive part of her story. When I've been out in the world as a foreign correspondent, I don't presume that Americans, people who will read my stories, or who will pick up the paper, necessarily care about these places. So, I was one of the first reporters to go to Darfur in Western Sudan when that crisis, when that conflict was breaking out, and so I viewed my objective. My objective was to try to make people who have busy lives, who have first world problems, who think that things are rough in their life, try to make them realize what real problems and real crises are. And when you're out there, you just see people and situations that are just unbelievable, and sometimes, and this is the kind of reporting that Anne mentioned, and that I believe so many times you're the only reporter there. It's not like it is at some of these big news events in the United States where there's scores of people and press conferences. You're the only journalist there. You're the only person there. And so if you're not telling this story, oftentimes no one will. And so you have this huge responsibility. So I think that in Darfur, just for months and months and months, I wanted that story to be followed, and I want people to know what's going on. After the earthquake in Haiti, that was a story that got a lot of international attention. But you're down there, and you see the suffering, you see how people are living, and you want to humanize the tale. And so you feel so often that you have this. It's grueling work. It's dangerous work. You get sick. You get injured. But you really feel like you have this huge responsibility when you're out there. For me, the sort of negative side of it is, and thankfully I have never experienced anything like what Anne has experienced, but there was a lot of danger, and in Mexico during the drug war, I was the only New York Times correspondent in Mexico for some years, and story after story, you'd start to push the envelope a little bit more and try to get a little bit closer to the drug cartels. I came up with the great idea of why don't I try to interview Chapo Guzman at one point.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, it was a great. I didn't get as far as Sean Penn. But there was real danger there, and I found myself in situations where I was thinking, what am I doing here? This doesn't make sense. This is dangerous. You're being followed. You're being threatened. And so you do have to be cautious. You can go too far. you do, later I was an editor, and I would always, while talking to correspondents, tell them, just reinforce to put safety first, and that I don't want a story if you're going to get injured, if you're going to put yourself in harm's way. I would just sort of remind the people of that, because there is this tendency when you're out there to view the story as the most important thing, and every once in a while it would sort of dawn on me that it could be my last, this could be my last story.
It sounds like it was the best and the worst of it. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'll start first with some positive things. Maybe the most positive was, I mentioned Jibril earlier, travels with Jibril. We've been all over the world. One of the, perhaps the most rewarding was that trip to South Africa when we saw Nelson Mandela. We got a chance to spend some time with him at his home, his private home. It was an interview that almost didn't happen because he happened to have been in the southern part of the country, and he was flying back to Pretoria, and because of some connections that our good friend Jibril had, he was able to stop in Johannesburg and then came and spent some time with us. So that was, in fact, some of the folks who were with us when we were done and we were leaving, heading back to our hotel. Literally, some of them cried on the bus because it was so moving. What I remembered, and I did several stories about it, one of the things I remembered was that his hands were so soft. And I thought it's incredible how soft is after spending 27 years pounding rocks. It was an amazing visit. Another one as an editor was 7 years ago when at the Miami Herald I launched this massive series that I had looking at blacks in the Americas. We decided to look at what was happening. We called it. I can't remember what the series looked at the fact that in the Americas, blacks were beginning to take on this sense of empowerment, and it's something that we hadn't reported on much at all. And just before, probably about a month or so, we have at the time we had 4 managing editors at Miami Herald, and we had our executive editor, and we had a story meeting so we can look at the series, and we were in this conference room, and we had all of the powers at the Miami Herald in this room listening to me talk about this series and why it is so important that we do this and have done it, and we spent a ton of money on it, sent people all over the Americas, and after it was over and I got back to my office and I was like, this is great. This is why I'm doing this. The fact that because of this interest, I can literally turn the Miami Herald and all of its resources towards something that I think is really important. So that was a highlight for me. Another thing on the why I'm doing this side, I mentioned earlier that I haven't been in Congo as this military uprising against and the following morning I got a call from one of my contacts at the embassy saying, have you been out so far today? I said, no, I haven't. He says, don't go out because there's a military uprising. Stay in your room and keep your head down. And then you can hear all of the shooting coming from town. But I had a stringer who had planned to come and see me that day. So he came to the hotel and says, well, no, I made it up to the hotel. Why don't we go and take a look at what was happening? And so we decided on foot to walk around Kinshasa. And you can see the military soldiers driving up and down the street, and ambulances pick up everything that they could commandeer, and literally shooting wildly. And several of the times we saw them coming up the street, we literally had to duck behind trees when they were firing. Around that time I said, why am I here? What am I doing? But thankfully we made it out okay.
We shockingly finally, I'm almost out of time for our conversation, but not before we take some questions from you guys. So if you keep your questions tight, and I'll make sure they keep their answers tight, and go for it, journalists. No, Rochelle, you don't get to ask the first question. Okay, yes, ma'am. Tell us where are you from?
Buenos días.
Buenos
Me ayudar a traducir.
I'm going to translate.
Okay, we're gonna and I'll translate the mic. Go ahead.
Okay.
Buenos días a todos. Yo soy Aida Luisa Córdoba. Vengo de Colombia,
I'm from Colombia. I
Sudamérica. Soy periodista también.
I'm journalist as well.
Y como saben, dentro de poco se va a firmar el fin del conflicto entre la guerrilla y el Estado.
And in a few moments, we will have the signature of the end of the conflict between the guerrillas and the state.
Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cuál creen ustedes que
My
debe ser
question to you,
el rol de los periodistas
what would be the role of journalists
y de los medios en general frente a
of
este
media
evento que va a cambiar, pues, digamos, la historia del país?
in this major event, which will change the face of the history of Colombia?
Sobre todo los periodistas afrodescendientes o afrocolombianos que, digamos, que tienen el papel, la función
and especially the role of journalists of color and of Afro-Colombian journalists who have a special role to play.
de que este proceso no sea blanqueado,
So that this process does not get blacked out in the media.
Mark, can I ask you to take that? Did everybody get the question? Okay.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I have no doubt that the world's media is going to cover the ceremony. The media covers ceremonies and moments like that. What we don't do a good enough job with, though, is following up and spending time and going back and seeing whether agreements actually stick. And that's what I think the New York Times and I think all media have to do is spend more time in Colombia and see whether this agreement sticks and see whether all the parties actually abide by it. So that's what I said.
Briefly, yeah.
I've been to Colombia at least twice this year, and that's something that's really, really important. My girl has a correspondent in Bogota, and as part of that coverage, one of the things that we've talked about a lot is looking at the situation with Afro-Colombians. Afro-Colombian, the series we did on blacks in the Americas, and that as we report on what's going on and this upcoming agreement, that we'll also look at what impact this new peace will have on the situation with Afro-Colombians. I know President Santos still has some obligations that he has not fulfilled, one of which is trying to get some Afro-Colombians in his cabinet, but something that I've tweeted about a lot, so I'll leave it there.
Rochelle, did you have a question?
I have a very quick question for the panelists. One of the things that the global journalism...
This is Rochelle Riley from the Detroit Free Press. She's going to identify herself too, like everybody else.
Thank you very much. I'm Rochelle Riley from the Detroit Free Press and co-chair of the Global Journalism Task Force, which seeks to increase the number of people of color who are providing global coverage, because we need to make sure we have a lot of voices telling the story of the world. And I would hope that two of you could tell us about an incident or an instance where your color or your background or your heritage made a difference in either how you told the story or getting the story.
Alfonso. Or Anne. Anne, we know she's Sudanese, so that's one.
I think we should say that because working on the African continent, which was a joy, even though kind of my specialty was the former Soviet Union before that, it was great because if I traveled to Rwanda, I was a Tutsi. If I went to Sudan, I'm a Dinka. If I go to Nigeria, I'm a Yoruba. I mean, I got a conflict. I'm like, who the hell am I? Everyone wanting to claim me. And actually, that was a positive of being a person of color and working there. Also, I would say that It's interesting, John. While you were fleeing across the Congo River, I was in Lubumbashi, the Eastern Congo, trying to get in.
I know. I was the only one there, actually.
And the reason I got to Kinshasa in the end is because Kabila's people actually had the rebels. They had one plane, and everyone wanted to get on that plane to get to Kinshasa. I was with other journalists, but I was the only one, and I believe it color played a role, the fact that maybe I'm female. I think actually gender played a role there. They were like, you know, madame, yes, mademoiselle, please, you're welcome. So I actually made it to plane, and the funny story is, when we got to Kinshasa, there were people lying in the streets, and Kabila wasn't on this plane at the time, it was just his entourage. People were lying in the streets, the trucks were going down, and people were cheering. And I remember arriving at the Intercontinental Hotel as one of the entourage, and you know, I'm there with my notebook, and I've never been there before, this was one of my first assignments, and a Japanese journalist comes up to me and says, "What does it feel like to be back in Kinshasa?" I just hitched a ride. But the reason I tell that story is because I wouldn't have gotten on there. Colour definitely played a role. These guys, you know, the rebel soldiers welcomed me on. Another story would be the fact that being female as well, and a black female, I was able to, I was on a bus going from Nairobi to Arusha in Tanzania to cover some of the trials that were going on at the international court there. And I think I've told this story before, but there I am, the bus is crammed, you know, the road is really rocky, and you know, it's not a great situation, you're in there, you're sweaty, and I sit down and I've got myself in the chair, and this woman just puts a baby in my lap. I'm like, what do I do with this thing? But you know what, she probably wouldn't have done that otherwise. She just thought that, hey, I'm a sister, I should know what to do with this baby.
What did you do with the baby?
I had the baby there thinking, what the hell? And then we started talking, and I learned so much about her life. And I also learned some parenting skills, even though I'm not a mother. And so to me, that was breaking the ice. And that was not just, I suppose, a colour thing, it was a gender thing as well. And my last example would be, because it can work the other way as well, it can be a disadvantage. If you look like someone who's from a group that's being targeted, then you're in trouble. And in fact, nearly something of now the Washington Post and I got our butts kicked in Kinshasa for that very reason. Me looking like a Banya Mulenge, Congolese Tutsi, and he at the time looking like a Frenchman, and both of those groups were hated. And we were attacked, so it can go the other way. So,
you want to?
Yeah, I think a couple of different stories.
Keep them brief, then get one more question.
In general, for me in my experience, particularly being in the Middle East, just with and now I'm living in Beirut in Lebanon, trying to work on a Lebanese accent, but I have a very heavy Egyptian Arabic accent, and so
let us hear it.
No. بس في الناس بحكي عربي أحسن مني هون. But my point is I have the ability and the flexibility to be able to go and mix in and blend in. People generally either tend to think that I'm either half Egyptian or half Sudanese, half North African, or the illegitimate love child of Thierry Henry, if any of you know football at all. I get that all the time. You look like Thierry Henry. I'm like, if I had his money. So that in the Middle East, the idea that you have a kind of a purely superficial physical way, I have a chance to kind of blend in and be less conspicuous and go to areas which other journalists can't. Being more particular to the African American experience, I think particularly when I was based in Johannesburg with CNN, and I remember doing a piece about a long piece we did on just the chronic issue of rape in South Africa. And I remember talking to this grandmother whose own children had died from HIV/AIDS, and she was taking care of the granddaughter who had been raped at 6 years old. And the idea of
having that sense of empathy, that sense of shared experience, because she, in her pursuit of justice, experiences the same microaggressions that we experience. The sense that, you know, her word is somehow of less value. That her sense of trying to find out what happened and why the police weren't pursuing the case and why the man was arrested, but because he had, you know, contacts, he was back out on the street, or why it's going to take 4 years just for a hearing before a trial due to, you know, problems with the justice system in South Africa. That kind of empathy of shared experience, I think, really helped me kind of really get a feel for the story and share her story and tell it in a fair but understand that struggle that she was going through.
Hi, I'm Lisa Armstrong. I'm a professor at the Community Graduate School of Journalism and also a freelance journalist. And I have a question. I covered sub-Saharan Africa for several years and then worked in Haiti from 2010 to 2014 as a freelance journalist. And I want to know what advice do you have people who were doing this as just, you know, without the backing of an organization? Because I've had grants. That's basically how I do my work, through grants and fellowships. But, you know, the current one I have is going to be up soon, and I need to find another one. And I think it's a struggle for a lot of, especially some of my students who are starting off. The advice is just go, but, you know, that's not always easy if you don't have money.
You have an answer to that?
Well, I have a
There's somebody behind you who wants to answer it, actually.
Yeah.
Then we'll come back to the panel.
Fulbright, and I'm talking about Fulbright grants. Successful.
NABJ.
And I'm a Fulbright alum. I highly recommend it. I sent him over here.
I really have some cool grants that are prestigious, and they will help you go study or research whatever you want around the world.
Whatever you want.
30 countries, and I want to see as many Black people.
Oh, man, I'm so excited by that answer to the question I asked. And also the one.
Can I just tag onto this and sort of represent for an area of the world that hasn't been talked about? So I started my career as a foreign correspondent in Asia. And I language plug studied Chinese and got a foreign language area studies scholarship to go and do in-depth study in Taiwan, and have a very Taiwanese accent of people. But I think sort of looking at grants that can get you to a place, and then find out from the people who have those grants who else they know in the grant community. I was lucky to be able to move from studying to getting a stringing job with the Far Eastern Economic Review and Newsweek, and then got hired, and then lots of other things happened. But
And where do you work now?
and now I'm director of the Knight Wallace Fellows Program at the Livingston Awards at the University of Michigan for all of a month. But I really do sort of believe in these grants that can help people get around the world. And a lot of the grants are great because it not only can support your journalism, but can support your language study while you're working on the journalism. And without the language study, it's that much more difficult.
I love these folks to work for themselves. I'm going to go ahead.
It's the grant part, because that part I've covered. It's the placing of the story. So a lot of
Let's bring this back to the panel. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
There's a couple of things, because I see tons and tons of submissions from journalists in the field. By the way, quickly on Asia, I've just come back from Taiwan, as you mentioned that, Korea and Japan, with my other hat as the chair of the International Press Institute. So we do a lot of work there. You know, the other thing that I tell people is that one, have an understanding of what the paper or television network, what they've done, what they're working on. You mentioned Haiti. We get a lot of, when I was at the Herald, we got lots of submissions from Haiti, because Haiti is still a place where a lot of people like to go, want to tell the story of what's happening in Haiti. But one problems with submissions to the Miami Herald from Haiti is that we cover Haiti better than and more intense than just about any. So a lot of the requests or the proposals that we got were stories that we've already done, or stories that Jackie Charles, who's our incredible Haiti reporter, is in the process of working on. So that's the first thing I tell people: know what we have done, and that would help you. The other thing is keep pitching. If there's something that you pitch that we're working on, we've done, what else do you have? Just keep and try to create a relationship so that when I see your email, I don't click next because I get a lot of those. That's essentially my recommendation.
Okay.
So sometimes not just say, I might be scrolling my own. Sometimes it's like offering to do a co-byline with someone, wherever the paper is based, and say that you're able to contribute. I mean, of course, you're looking to be paid, but it's also worth pitching that. So.
Listen, I'm going to have to wind this up because we're already over time, but as you can see, there's a lot of networking and conversation to be done. And if you find a pair of eyeglasses that Rochelle has lost, please pass them. That's why she's feeling her way around the room. Oh, there they are. Oh, thank you. I'll get them.
See, it takes a village to find the eyeglasses.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Please give the amazing Gwen Ifill a hand. This is fantastic, and this is why we do this. Because I heard at least 3 questions answered. I know that there are people in here who are very interested in doing this, and this is the time where we now open up our little mini reception. We're going to ask that you let our wonderful panelists, and let's thank them again, John Yearwood, Mark Lacey, and Simmons, and Alfonso Mark. Alfonso, I love your story. I'm not going to do that, but I love what you did. Just give them a second to go back and grab some things for themselves and then fall right in. And we're just going to hang out a little bit and chat because this is so important. And if you are interested in becoming a member of the Global Journalism Task Force, we're going to have a short meeting after we just hang out just to talk about the 2 projects that we're working on. But we hope that you'll join us so that we can work year-round on making sure there are more voices of color telling the story of all colors in the world. Thank you.